Eros and Civilization, A Philosophical Inquiry into Freud by Herbert Marcuse. This is Chapter 2, The Origin of the Repressed Individual, Ontogenesis. Freud traces the development of repression in the instinctual structure of the individual. The fate of human freedom and happiness is fought out and decided in the struggle of the instincts, literally a struggle of life and death, in which soma and psyche, nature and civilization participate. This biological and at the same time sociological dynamic is the center of Freud's metapsychology. He unfolded these decisive hypotheses with constant hesitations and qualifications, and then left them in abeyance. The final theory of instincts, in whose context they emerged after 1920, was preceded by at least two different conceptions of the anatomy of the mental personality. There is no need here to review the history of the psychoanalytic theory of instincts. A brief summary of some of its features may suffice to prepare for our discussion. Throughout the various stages of Freud's theory, the mental apparatus appears as a dynamic union of opposites, of the unconscious and the conscious structures, of primary and secondary processes, of inherited, constitutionally fixed and acquired forces, of soma psyche and the external reality. This dualistic construction continues to prevail even in the later tripartite topology of id, ego, and superego. The intermediary and overlapping elements tend toward the two poles. They find their most striking expression in the two ultimate principles which govern the mental apparatus: pleasure principle and reality principle. At the earliest stage of its development, Freud's theory is built around the antagonism between sex, libidinous, and ego, self-preservation, instincts. At the latest stage, it is centered on the conflict between the life instincts, Eros, and the death instinct. During a brief intermediary period, the dualistic conception was replaced by the assumption of one all-pervasive, narcissistic libido. Throughout all these modifications of Freud's theory, sexuality retains its predominant place in the instinctual structure. The predominant role of sexuality is rooted in the very nature of the mental apparatus as Freud conceived it. If the primary mental processes are governed by the pleasure principle, then that instinct which, in operating under this principle, sustains life itself must be the life instinct. But Freud's early concept of sexuality is still far remote from that of Eros as life instinct. The sexual instinct is first only one specific instinct, or rather group of instincts, side by side with the ego, or self-preservation instincts, and is defined by its specific genesis, aim, and object. Far from being pansexualism, Freud's theory is, at least, until his introduction of narcissism in 1914, characterized by a restriction of the scope of sexuality, a restriction which is maintained in spite of the persistent difficulty in verifying the independent existence of non-sexual self-preservation instincts. It is still a long way to the hypothesis that the latter are merely component instincts, whose function it is to assure that the organism shall follow its own path to death, and to ward off any possible ways of returning to inorganic existence other than those which are immanent in the organism itself, or which might be another way of saying the same thing, that they are themselves of a libidinal nature, part of Eros. However, the discovery of infantile sexuality and of the all but unlimited erotogenic zones of the body anticipates the subsequent recognition of the libidinal components of the self-preservation instincts and prepares the ground for the final reinterpretation of sexuality in terms of the life instinct, Eros. In the final formulation, the theory of instincts, the self-preservation instincts, the cherished sanctuary of the individual and its justification in the struggle for existence, are dissolved. Their work now appears as that of the generic sex instincts, or, insofar as self-preservation is achieved through socially useful aggression, as the work of the destruction instincts. Eros and the death instinct are now the two basic instincts. But it is of the greatest importance to notice that in introducing the new conception, Freud is driven to emphasize time and again the common nature of the instincts prior to their differentiation. The outstanding and frightening event is the discovery of the fundamental regressive or conservative tendency in all instinctual life. Freud cannot escape the suspicion that he has come upon a hitherto unnoticed universal attribute of the instincts and perhaps of organic life in general, namely a compulsion inherent in organic life to restore an earlier state of things, which the living entity has been obliged to abandon under the pressure of external disturbing forces, a kind of organic elasticity or inertia inherent in organic life. This would be the ultimate content or substance of those primary processes, which Freud from the beginning recognized as operating in the unconscious. They were first designated as the striving for the free outflow of the quantities of excitation caused by the impact of external reality on the organism. The entirely free outflow would be the complete gratification. Now, 20 years later, Freud still starts from this assumption. The pleasure principle, then, is a tendency operating in the service of a function whose business it is to free the mental apparatus entirely from excitation, or to keep the amount of excitation in it constant, or to keep it as low as possible. We cannot yet decide with certainty in favor of any of these ways of putting it. But more and more the inner logic of the conception asserts itself. Constant freedom from excitation has been finally abandoned at the birth of life. The instinctual tendency toward equilibrium, thus, is ultimately regression behind life itself. The primary processes of the mental apparatus and their striving for integral gratification seem to be fatally bound to the most universal endeavor of all living substance, namely to return to the quiescence of the inorganic world. The instincts are drawn into the orbit of death. It is true that life is governed by Fechner's principle of constant equilibrium. It consists of a continuous descent toward death. The nirvana principle now emerges as the dominating tendency of mental life, and perhaps of nervous life in general. And the pleasure principle appears in the light of the nirvana principle as an expression of the nirvana principle. The effort to reduce, to keep constant, or to remove internal tension due to stimuli, the nirvana principle, finds expression in the pleasure principle, and our recognition of this fact is one of our strongest reasons for believing in the existence of death instincts. However, the primacy of the nirvana principle, the terrifying convergence of pleasure and death, is dissolved as soon as it is established. No matter how universal the regressive inertia or organic life, the instincts strive to attain their objective in fundamentally different modes. The difference is tantamount to that of sustaining and destroying life. Out of the common nature of instinctual life develop two antagonistic instincts. The life instincts, Eros, gain ascendancy over the death instincts. They continuously counteract and delay the descent toward death. Fresh tensions are introduced by the claims of Eros, of the sexual instincts, as expressed in instinctual needs. They begin their life-reproducing function with the separation of the germ cells from the organism, and then coalesce of two such cell bodies, proceeding to the establishment and preservation of ever greater unities of life. They thus win against death the potential immortality of the living substance. The dynamic dualism of instinctual life seems assured. However, Freud at once harks back to the original common nature of the instincts. The life instincts are conservative in the same sense as the other instincts in that they bring back earlier states of the living substance, although they are conservative to a higher degree. Sexuality would thus ultimately obey the same principle as the death instinct. Later, Freud, in order to illustrate the regressive character of sexuality, recalls Plato's fantastic hypothesis that living substance at the time of its coming to life was torn apart into small particles, which have ever since endeavored to reunite through the sexual instincts. Does Eros, in spite of all the evidence in the last analysis, work in the service of the death instinct? And is life really only one long detour to death? But the evidence is strong enough, and the detour is long enough to warrant the opposite assumption. Eros is defined as the great unifying force that preserves all life. The ultimate relation between Eros and Thanatos remains obscure. If Eros and Thanatos thus emerge as the two basic instincts, whose ubiquitous presence in continuous fusion and diffusion characterize the life process, then this theory of instincts is far more than a reformulation of the preceding Freudian concepts. Psychoanalysts have correctly emphasized that Freud's last metapsychology is based on an essentially new concept of instinct. The instincts are defined no longer in terms of their origin and their organic function, but in terms of a determining force which gives the life processes a definite direction, in terms of life principles. The notions instinct, principle, regulation are being assimilated. The rigid opposition between a mental apparatus regulated by certain principles on the one side and instincts penetrating into the apparatus from the outside on the other could no longer be maintained. Moreover, the dualistic conception of the instincts, which had become questionable ever since the introduction of narcissism, now seems to be threatened from quite a different direction. With the recognition of the libidinal components of the ego instincts, it became practically impossible to point to any instincts other than the libidinal ones, to find any instinctual impulses which do not disclose themselves as derivatives of Eros. This inability to discover in the primary instinctual structure anything that is not Eros, the monism of sexuality, an inability which, as we shall see, is the very token of the truth, now seems to turn into its opposite, into a monism of death. To be sure, the analysis of the repetition and regression compulsion, and ultimately the sadistic constituents of Eros, restores the shaken dualistic conception. The death instinct becomes Eros's partner in its own right in the primary instinctual structure, and the perpetual struggle between the two constitutes the primary dynamic. However, the discovery of the common conservative nature of the instincts militates against the dualistic conception and keeps Freud's late metapsychology in that state of suspense and depth, which makes it one of the great intellectual ventures in the science of man. The quest for the common origin of the two basic instincts can no longer be silenced. Fennekel pointed out that Freud himself made a decisive step in this direction by assuming a displaceable energy which is in itself neutral, but is able to join forces either with an erotic or with a destructive impulse, with the life or the death instinct. Never before has death been so consistently taken into the essence of life, but never before also has death come so close to Eros. Fennekel raises the decisive question whether the antithesis of Eros and death instinct is not the differentiation of an originally common root. He suggests that the phenomena grouped together as the death instinct may be taken as expression of a principle valid for all instincts, a principle which, in the course of development, might have been modified by external influences. Moreover, if the regression compulsion in all organic life is striving for integral quiescence, if the nirvana principle is the ground of the pleasure principle, then the necessity of death appears in an entirely new light. The death instinct is destructiveness, not for its own sake, but for the relief of tension. The descent toward death is an unconscious flight from pain and want. It is an expression of the eternal struggle against suffering and repression. And the death instinct itself seems to be affected by the historical changes which affect this struggle. Further explanation of the historical character of the instincts requires placing them in the new concept of the person, which corresponds to the last version of Freud's theory of instincts. The main layers of the mental structure are now designated as id, ego, and superego. The fundamental, oldest, and largest layer is the id, the domain of the unconscious, of the primary instincts. The id is free from the forms and principles which constitute the conscious social individual. It is neither affected by time nor troubled by contradictions. It knows no values, no good and evil, no morality. It does not aim at self-preservation. All it strives for is satisfaction of its instinctual needs, in accordance with the pleasure principle. Under the influence of the external world, the environment, a part of the id which is equipped with the organs for the reception of and the protection from stimuli, gradually developed into the ego. It is the mediator between the id and the external world. Perception and consciousness are only the smallest and most superficial part of the ego, the part topographically closest to the external world. But by virtue of these instrumentalities, the perceptual conscious system, the ego preserves its existence, observing and testing the reality, taking and preserving a true picture of it, adjusting itself to the reality and altering the latter in its own interest. Thus the ego has the task of representing the external world for the id, and so of saving it. For the id, blindly striving to gratify its instincts in complete disregard of the superior strength of outside forces, could not otherwise escape annihilation. In fulfilling this task, the chief function of the ego is that of coordinating, altering, organizing, and controlling the instinctual impulses of the id so as to minimize conflicts with reality, to repress impulses that are incompatible with the reality, to reconcile others with the reality by changing their object, delaying or diverting their gratification, transforming their mode of gratification, amalgamating them with other impulses, and so on. In this way, the ego dethrones the pleasure principle, which exerts undisputed sway over the processes in the id, and substitutes for it the reality principle, which promises greater security and greater success. In spite of its all-important functions, which secure instinctual gratification to an organism that would otherwise almost certainly be destroyed or destroy itself, the ego retains its birthmark as an outgrowth of the id. In relation to the id, the processes of the ego remain secondary processes. Nothing elucidates more strikingly the dependent function of the ego than Freud's early formulation that all thinking is merely a detour from the memory of gratification to the identical cathexis of the same memory, which is to be reached once more by the path of motor experiences. The memory of gratification is at the origin of all thinking, and the impulse to recapture past gratification is the hidden driving power behind the process of thought. Because the reality principle makes this process an unending series of detours, the ego experiences reality as predominantly hostile, and the ego's attitude is predominantly one of defense. But on the other hand, since reality, via these detours, provides gratification, although only modified gratification, the ego has to reject those impulses, which would, if granted, destroy its life. The ego's defense is thus a two-front struggle. In the course of the development of the ego, another mental entity arises, the superego. It originates from the long dependency of the infant on his parents. The parental influence remains the core of the superego. Subsequently, a number of societal and cultural influences are taken in by the superego until it coagulates into the powerful representative of established morality and what people call the higher things in human life. Now, the external restrictions which first the parents and then other societal agencies have imposed upon the individual are introjected into the ego and become its conscience. Henceforth, the sense of guilt, the need for punishment generated by the transgressions or by the wish to transgress these restrictions, especially in the Oedipus situation, permeates the mental life. As a rule, the ego carries out repressions in the service and at the behest of its superego. However, the repressions soon become unconscious, automatic as it were, and a great part of the sense of guilt remains unconscious. Franz Alexander speaks of the transformation of conscious condemnation, which depends upon perception and judgment, into an unconscious process of repression. He assumes a tendency toward a decrease of mobile psychic energy to a tonic form, corporalization of the psyche. This development, by which originally conscious struggles with the demands of reality, the parents and their successors in the formation of the superego, are transformed into unconscious automatic reactions, is of the utmost importance for the course of civilization. The reality principle asserts itself through a shrinking of the conscious ego and a significant direction. The autonomous development of the instincts is frozen, and their pattern is fixed at the childhood level. Adherence to a status quo ante is implanted in the instinctual structure. The individual becomes instinctually reactionary, in the literal as well as the figurative sense. It exercises against itself unconsciously a severity which once was appropriate to an infantile stage of its development, but which has long since become obsolete in the light of the rational potentialities of individual and social maturity. The individual punishes itself, and then is punished for deeds which are undone or which are no longer incompatible with civilized reality, with civilized man. The superego thus enforces not only the demands of reality, but also those of a past reality. By virtue of these unconscious mechanisms, the mental development lags behind the real development, or, since the former is itself a factor in the latter, retards the real development, denies its potentialities in the name of the past. The past reveals its twofold function in the shaping of the individual and of his society. Recalling the dominion of the primal pleasure principle, where freedom from want was a necessity, the id carries the memory traces of this state forward into every present future. It projects the past into the future. However, the superego, also unconscious, rejects this instinctual claim on the future, in the name of a past no longer one of integral satisfaction, but one of bitter adjustment to a punitive present, phylogenetically and ontogenetically with the progress of civilization, and with the growth of the individual. The memory traces of the unity between freedom and necessity become submerged in the acceptance of the necessity of unfreedom. Rational and rationalized, memory itself bows to the reality principle. The reality principle sustains the organism in the external world. In the case of the human organism, this is an historical world. The external world faced by the growing ego is at any stage a specific socio-historical organization of reality, affecting the mental structure through specific societal agencies or agents. It has been argued that Freud's concept reality principle obliterates this fact by making historical contingencies into biological necessities. His analysis of the repressive transformation of the instincts under the impact of the reality principle generalizes from a specific historical form of reality to reality pure and simple. This criticism is valid, but its validity does not vitiate the truth in Freud's generalization, namely that a repressive organization of the instincts underlies all historical forms of the reality principle in civilization. If he justifies the repressive organization of the instincts by the irreconcilability between the primary pleasure principle and the reality principle, he expresses the historical fact that civilization has progressed as organized domination. This awareness guides his entire phylogenetic construction, which derives civilization from the replacement of the patriarchal despotism of the primal horde by the internalized despotism of the brother clan. Precisely because all civilization has been organized domination, the historical development assumes the dignity and necessity of a universal biological development. The unhistorical character of the Freudian concepts thus contains the elements of its opposite. Their historical substance must be recaptured, not by adding some sociological factors, as do the cultural neo-Freudian schools, but by unfolding their own content. In this sense, our subsequent discussion is an extrapolation, which derives from Freud's theory, notions, and propositions implied in it, only in a reified form, in which historical processes appear as natural biological processes. Terminologically, this extrapolation calls for a duplication of concepts. The Freudian terms which do not adequately differentiate between the biological and the sociological, and the socio-historical vicissitudes of the instincts must be paired with corresponding terms of denoting the specific socio-historical component. Presently, we shall introduce two such terms. A. Surplus repression, the restrictions necessitated by social domination. This is distinguished from basic repression, the modifications of the instincts necessary for the perpetuation of the human race in civilization. B. Performance principle, the prevailing historical form of the reality principle. Behind the reality principle lies the fundamental fact of ananke, or scarcity, which means that the struggle for existence takes place in a world too poor for the satisfaction of human needs, without constant restraint, renunciation, delay. In other words, whatever satisfaction is possible necessitates work, more or less painful arrangements and undertakings for the procurement of the means for satisfying needs. For the duration of work, which occupies practically the entire existence of the mature individual, pleasure is suspended and pain prevails. And since the basic instincts strive for the prevalence of pleasure and for the absence of pain, the pleasure principle is incompatible with reality, and the instincts have to undergo a repressive regimentation. However, this argument, which looms large in Freud's metapsychology, is fallacious insofar as it applies to the brute fact of scarcity, what actually is the consequence of a specific organization of scarcity, and of a specific existential attitude enforced by this organization. The prevalent scarcity has, throughout civilization, although in different modes, been organized in such a way that it has not been distributed collectively in accordance with individual needs, nor has the procurement of goods for the satisfaction of needs been organized with the objective of best satisfying the developing needs of the individuals. Instead, the distribution of scarcity as well as the effort of overcoming it, the mode of work, have been imposed upon individuals, first by mere violence, subsequently by a more rational utilization of power. However, no matter how useful this rationality was for the progress of the whole, it remained the rationality of domination, and the gradual conquest of scarcity was inextricably bound up with and shaped by the interest of domination. Domination differs from rational exercise of authority. The latter, which is inherent in any societal division of labor, is derived from knowledge and confined to the administration of functions and arrangements necessary for the advancement of the whole. In contrast, domination is exercised by a particular group of individuals domination is exercised by a particular group or individual in order to sustain and enhance itself in a privileged position. Such domination does not exclude technical, material, and intellectual progress, but only as an unavoidable byproduct while preserving irrational scarcity, want, and constraint. The various modes of domination of man and nature result in various historical forms of the reality principle. For example, a society in which all members normally work for a living requires other modes of repression than a society in which labor is the exclusive province of one specific group. Similarly, repression will be different in scope and degree according to whether social production is oriented on individual consumption or on profit, whether a market economy prevails or a planned economy, whether private or collective property. These differences affect the very content of the reality principle, for every form of the reality principle must be embodied in a system of societal institutions and relations, laws and values which transmit and enforce the required modification of the instincts. This body of the reality principle is different at the different stages of civilization. Moreover, while any form of the reality principle demands a considerable degree and scope of repressive control over the instincts, the specific historical institutions of the reality principle and the specific interests of domination introduce additional controls over and above those indispensable for civilized human association. These additional controls arising from the specific institutions of domination are what we denote as surplus repression. For example, the modifications and deflections of instinctual energy necessitated by the perpetuation of the monogamic patriarchal family, or by hierarchical division of labor, or by public control over the individual's private existence, are instances of surplus repression pertaining to the institutions of a particular reality principle. They are added to the basic phylogenetic restrictions of the instincts, which mark the development of man from the human animal to the animal sapiens. The power to restrain and guide instinctual drives to make biological necessities into individual needs and desires increases rather than reduces gratification. The mediation of nature, the breaking of its compulsion, is the human form of the pleasure principle. Such restrictions of the instincts may first have been enforced by scarcity and by the protracted dependence of the human animal, but they have become the privilege and distinction of man, which enabled him to transform the blind necessity of the fulfillment of want into desired gratification. The containment of the partial sexual impulses, the progress to genitality, belong to this basic layer of repression, which makes possible intensified pleasure. The maturation of the organism involves normal and natural maturation of pleasure. However, the mastery of instinctual drives may also be used against gratification. In the history of civilization, basic repression and surplus repression have been inextricably intertwined, and the normal progress to genitality has been organized in such a way that the partial impulses in their zones were all but desexualized in order to conform to the requirements of a specific social organization of the human existence. The vicissitudes of the proximity senses, smell and taste, provide a good example for the interrelation between basic repression and surplus repression. Freud thought that the coprophilic elements in the instinct have proved incompatible with our aesthetic ideas, probably since the time when man developed an upright posture and so removed his organ of smell from the ground. There is, however, another aspect to the subduing of the proximity senses in civilization. They succumb to the rigidly enforced taboos on too intense bodily pleasure. The pleasure of smell and taste is much more of a bodily, physical one, hence also more akin to sexual pleasure, than is the more sublime pleasure aroused by sound and the least bodily of all pleasures, the sight of something beautiful. Smell and taste give, as it were, unsublimated pleasure per se, and unrepressed disgust. They relate and separate individuals immediately, without the generalized and conventionalized forms of consciousness, morality, aesthetics. Such immediacy is incompatible with the effectiveness of organized domination, with a society which tends to isolate people, to put distance between them, and to prevent spontaneous relationships and the natural animal-like expressions of such relations. The pleasure of the proximity senses plays on the erotogenic zones of the body, and does so only for the sake of pleasure. Their unrepressed development would eroticize the organism to such an extent that it would counteract the desexualization of the organism required by its social utilization as an instrument of labor. Throughout the recorded history of civilization, the instinctual constraint enforced by scarcity has been intensified by constraints enforced by the hierarchical distribution of scarcity and labor. The interests of domination added surplus repression to the organization of the instincts under the reality principle. The pleasure principle was dethroned not only because it militated against progress in civilization, but also because it militated against a civilization whose progress perpetuates domination and toil. Freud seems to acknowledge this fact when he compares the attitude of civilization towards sexuality with that of a tribe or a section of the population which has gained the upper hand and is exploiting the rest to its own advantage. Fear of a revolt among the oppressed then becomes a motive for even stricter regulations. The modification of the instincts under the reality principle affects the life instinct as well as the death instinct, but the development of the latter becomes fully understandable only in the light of the development of the life instinct, i.e., of the repressive organization of sexuality. The sex instincts bear the brunt of the reality principle. Their organization culminates in the subjection of the partial sex instincts to the primacy of genitality, and in their subjugation under the function of procreation. The process involves the diversion of libido from one's own body toward an alien object of the opposite sex, the mastery of primary and secondary narcissism. The gratification of the partial instincts and of non-procreative genitality are, according to the degree of their independence, tabooed as perversions, sublimated or transformed into subsidiaries of procreative sexuality. Moreover, the latter is in most civilizations channeled into monogamic institutions. The organization results in a quantitative and qualitative restriction of sexuality. The unification of the partial instincts and their subjugation under the procreative function alter the very nature of sexuality. From an autonomous principle governing the entire organism, it is turned into a specialized temporary function, into a means for an end. In terms of the pleasure principle governing the unorganized sex instincts, reproduction is merely a byproduct. The primary content of sexuality is the function of obtaining pleasure from zones of the body. This function is only subsequently brought into the service of that of reproduction. Freud emphasizes time and again that without its organization for such service, sexuality would preclude all non-sexual and therefore all civilized societal relations, even at the stage of mature heterosexual genitality. The conflict between civilization and sexuality is caused by the circumstance that sexual love is a relationship between two people, in which a third can only be superfluous or disturbing, whereas civilization is founded on relations between larger groups of persons. When a love relationship is at its height, no room is left for any interest in the surrounding world. The pair of lovers are sufficient unto themselves, do not even need the child they have in common to make them happy. And earlier, in arguing the distinction between sexual and self-preservation instincts, he points out the fatal implications of sexuality. It is undeniable that the exercise of this function does not always bring advantage to the individual, as do his other activities, but that for the sake of an exceptionally high degree of pleasure, he is involved by this function in dangers which jeopardize his life and often enough exact it. But how does this interpretation of sexuality as an essentially explosive force in conflict with civilization justify the definition of Eros as the effort to combine organic substances into ever larger unities, to establish ever greater unities and to preserve them thus, in short, to bind together? How can sexuality become the probable substitute for the instinct towards perfection, the power that holds together everything in the world? How does the notion of the social character of sexuality jibe with the supposition that love relationships, or to use a more neutral expression, emotional ties, also constitute the essence of the group mind? The apparent contradiction is not solved by attributing the explosive connotations to the earlier concept of sexuality and the constructive ones to Eros, for the latter includes both. In Civilization and its Discontents, immediately following the passage quoted above, Freud joins the two aspects. In no other case does Eros so plainly betray the core of his being, his aim of making one out of many, but when he has achieved it in the proverbial way through the love of two human beings, he is not willing to go further. Nor can the contradiction be eliminated by locating the constructive cultural force of Eros only in the sublimated modes of sexuality. According to Freud, the drive toward ever larger unities belongs to the biological organic nature of Eros itself. At this stage of our interpretation, rather than trying to reconcile the two contradictory aspects of sexuality, we suggest that they reflect the inner unreconciled tension in Freud's theory, against his notion of the inevitable biological conflict between pleasure principle and reality principle, between sexuality and civilization, militates the idea of the unifying and gratifying power of Eros, chained and won out in a sick civilization. This idea would imply that the free Eros does not preclude lasting civilized societal relationships, that it repels only the supra-repressive organization of societal relationships under a principle which is the negation of the pleasure principle. Freud allows himself the image of a civilization consisting of pairs of individuals, libidinally satisfied in each other and linked to all the others by work and common interest. But he adds that such a desirable state does not exist and never has existed, that culture exacts a heavy toll of aim-inhibited libido, and heavy restrictions upon sexual life are unavoidable. He finds the reason for culture's antagonism to sexuality in the aggressive instincts deeply fused with sexuality. They threaten time and again to destroy civilization, and they force culture to call up every possible reinforcement against them. Hence its system of methods by which mankind is to be driven to identifications and aim-inhibited love relationships. Hence the restrictions on sexual life. But again, Freud shows that this repressive system does not really solve the conflict. Civilization plunges into a destructive dialectic. The perpetual restrictions on Eros ultimately weaken the life instincts and thus strengthen and release the very forces against which they were called up, those of destruction. This dialectic, which constitutes the still unexplored and even tabooed core of Freud's metapsychology, will be explored later on. Here we shall use Freud's antagonistic conception of Eros for elucidating the specific historical mode of repressiveness imposed by the established reality principle. In introducing the term surplus repression, we have focused the discussion on the institutions and relations that constitute the social body of the reality principle. These do not just represent the challenging external manifestations of one and the same reality principle, but actually change the reality principle itself. Consequently, in our attempt to elucidate the scope and the limits of the prevalent repressiveness in contemporary civilization, we shall have to describe it in terms of the specific reality principle that has governed the origins and the growth of this civilization. We designate it as performance principle in order to emphasize that under its rule, society is stratified according to the competitive economic performances of its members. It is clearly not the only historical reality principle. Other modes of societal organization not merely prevailed in primitive cultures, but also survived into the modern period. The performance principle, which is that of an acquisitive and antagonistic society in the process of constant expansion, presupposes a long development during which domination has been increasingly rationalized. Control over social labor now reproduces society on an enlarged scale and under improving conditions. For a long way, the interests of domination and the interests of the whole coincide. The profitable utilization of the productive apparatus fulfills the needs and faculties of the individuals. For the vast majority of the population, the scope and mode of satisfaction are determined by their own labor, but their labor is work for an apparatus which they do not control, which operates as an independent power to which individuals must submit if they want to live. And it becomes the more alien, the more specialized the division of labor becomes. Men do not live their own lives, but perform pre-established functions. While they work, they do not fulfill their own needs and faculties, but work in alienation. Work has now become general, and so have the restrictions placed upon the libido. Labor time, which is the largest part of the individual's lifetime, is painful time. For alienated labor is absence of gratification, negation of the pleasure principle. Libido is diverted for socially useful performances in which the individual works for himself only insofar as he works for the apparatus, engaged in activities that mostly do not coincide with his own faculties and desires. However, and this point is decisive, the instinctual energy thus withdrawn does not accrue to the unsublimated aggressive instincts because its social utilization in labor sustains and even enriches the life of the individual. The restrictions imposed upon the libido appear as the more rational, the more universal they become, the more they permeate the whole of society. They operate on the individual as external objective laws and as an internalized force. The societal authority is absorbed into the conscience and into the unconscious of the individual and works as his own desire, morality, and fulfillment. In the normal development, the individual lives his repression freely as his own life. He desires what he is supposed to desire. His gratifications are profitable to him and to others. He is reasonably and often even exuberantly happy. This happiness, which takes place part-time during the few hours of leisure between the working days or working nights, but sometimes also during work, enables him to continue his performance, which in turn perpetuates his labor and that of the others. His erotic performance is brought in line with his societal performance. Repression disappears in the grand objective order of things which rewards more or less adequately the complying individuals, and in doing so reproduces more or less adequately society as a whole. The conflict between sexuality and civilization unfolds with this development of domination. Under the rule of the performance principle, body and mind are made into instruments of alienated labor. They can function as such instruments only if they renounce the freedom of the libidinal subject-object, which the human organism primarily is and desires. The distribution of time plays a fundamental role in this transformation. Man exists only part-time during the working days as an instrument of alienated performance. The rest of the time he is free for himself. If the average working day, including preparation and travel to and from work, amounts to 10 hours, and if the biological needs for sleep and nourishment require another 10 hours, the free time would be 4 out of each 24 hours throughout the greater part of the individual's life. This free time would be potentially available for pleasure, but the pleasure principle which governs the id is timeless, also in the sense that it militates against the temporal dismemberment of pleasure, against its distribution in small separated doses. A society governed by the performance principle must of necessity impose such distribution, because the organism must be trained for its alienation at its very roots, the pleasure ego. It must learn to forget the claim for timeless and useless gratification, for the eternity of pleasure. Moreover, from the working day, alienation and regimentation spread into the free time. Such coordination does not have to be, and normally is not enforced from without by the agencies of society. The basic control of leisure is achieved by the length of the working day itself, by the tiresome and mechanical routine of alienated labor. These require that leisure be a passive relaxation and a recreation of energy for work. Not until the late stage of industrial civilization, when the growth of productivity threatens to overflow the limits set by repressive domination, has the technique of mass manipulation developed an entertainment industry which directly controls leisure time, or has the state directly taken over the reinforcement of such controls. The individual is not to be left alone, for left to itself and supported by a free intelligence aware of the potentialities of liberation from the reality of repression, the libidinal energy generated by the id would thrust against its ever more extraneous limitations and strive to engulf an ever larger field of existential relations, thereby exploding the reality ego and its repressive performances. The organization of sexuality reflects the basic features of the performance principle and its organization of society. Freud emphasizes the aspect of centralization. It is especially operative in the unification of the various objects of the partial instincts into one libidinal object of the opposite sex, and in the establishment of genital supremacy. In both cases, the unifying process is repressive. That is to say, the partial instincts do not develop freely into a higher stage of gratification, which preserves their objectives, but are cut off and reduced to subservient functions. This process achieves the socially necessary desexualization of the body. The libido becomes concentrated in one part of the body, leaving most of the rest free for use as the instrument of labor. The temporal reduction of the libido is thus supplemented by its spatial reduction. Originally, the sex instinct has no extraneous temporal and spatial limitations on its subject and object. Sexuality is by nature polymorphous, perverse. The societal organization of the sex instinct taboos as perversions practically all its manifestations, which do not serve or prepare for the procreative function. Without the most severe restrictions, they would counteract the sublimation on which the growth of culture depends. According to Fennekel, pregenital strivings are the object of sublimation, and genital primacy is its prerequisite. Freud questioned why the taboo on the perversions is sustained with such an extraordinary rigidity. He concluded that no one can forget that the perversions are not merely detestable, but also something monstrous and terrifying, as if they exerted a seductive influence, as if at bottom a secret envy of those who enjoy them had to be strangled. The perversions seem to give a promesse de bonheur greater than that of normal sexuality. What is the source of their promise? Freud emphasized the exclusive character of the deviations from normality, the rejection of the procreative sex act. The perversions thus express rebellion against the subjugation of sexuality under the order of procreation, and against the institutions which guarantee this order. Psychoanalytic theory sees in the practices that exclude or prevent procreation an opposition against continuing the chain of reproduction, and thereby of paternal domination, an attempt to prevent the reappearance of the father. The perversions seem to reject the entire enslavement of the pleasure ego by the reality ego. Claiming instinctual freedom in a world of repression, they are often characterized by a strong rejection of that feeling of guilt which accompanies sexual repression. By virtue of the revolt against the performance principle in the name of the pleasure principle, the perversions show a deep affinity to fantasy, as that mental activity which was kept free from reality testing and remained subordinated to the pleasure principle alone. Fantasy not only plays a constitutive role in the perverse manifestations of sexuality. As artistic imagination, it also links the perversions with the images of integral freedom and gratification. In a repressive order which enforces the equation between normal and socially useful and good, the manifestations of pleasure for its own sake must appear as fleurs de mal. Against a society which employs sexuality as means for a useful end, the perversions uphold sexuality as an end in itself. They thus place themselves outside the dominion of the performance principle and challenge its very foundation. They establish libidinal relationships which society must ostracize, because they threaten to reverse the process of civilization which turned the organism into an instrument of work. They are a symbol of what had to be suppressed so that suppression could prevail and organize the ever more efficient domination of man and nature. A symbol of the destructive identity between freedom and happiness. Moreover, license in the practice of perversions would endanger the orderly reproduction not only of labor power, but perhaps even of mankind itself. The fusion of Eros and death instinct, precarious even in the normal human existence, here seems to be loosened beyond the danger point, and the loosening of this fusion makes manifest the erotic component in the death instinct, and the fatal component in the sex instinct. The perversions suggest the ultimate identity of Eros and death instinct, or the submission of Eros to the death instinct. The cultural task, the life task of the libido, namely to make the destructive instinct harmless, here comes to naught. The instinctual drive in search of ultimate and integral fulfillment regresses from the pleasure principle to the nirvana principle. Civilization has acknowledged and sanctioned this supreme danger. It admires the convergence of death instinct and Eros in the highly sublimated and monogamic creations of the Liebestod, which outlawing the less complete but more realistic expressions of Eros as an end in itself. There is no societal organization of the death instinct paralleling that of Eros. The very depth at which the instinct operates protects it from such a systematic and methodical organization. Only some of its derivative manifestations are susceptible to control. As a component of sadomasochistic gratification, it falls under the strict taboo on perversions. Still, the entire progress of civilization is rendered possible only by the transformation and utilization of the death instinct, or its derivatives. The diversion of primary destructiveness from the ego to the external world feeds technological progress, and the use of the death instinct for the formation of the superego achieves the punitive submission of the pleasure ego to the reality principle and assures civilized morality. In this transformation, the death instinct is brought into the service of Eros. The aggressive impulses provide energy for the continuous alteration, mastery, and exploitation of nature to the advantage of mankind. In attacking, splitting, changing, pulverizing things and animals, and periodically also man extends his dominion over the world and advances to ever richer stages of civilization. But civilization preserves throughout the mark of its deadly component. We seem almost forced to accept the dreadful hypothesis that in the very structure and substance of all human constructive social efforts, there is embodied a principle of death, that there is no progressive impulse but must become fatigued, that the intellect can provide no permanent defense against a vigorous barbarism. The socially channeled destructiveness reveals time and again its origin in a drive which defies all usefulness. Beneath the manifold rational and rationalized motives for war against national and group enemies, for the destructive conquest of time, space, and man, the deadly partner of Eros becomes manifest in the persistent approval and participation of the victims. In the construction of the personality, the destruction instinct manifests itself most clearly in the formation of the superego. To be sure, by its defensive role against the unrealistic impulses of the id, by its function in the lasting conquest of the Oedipus complex. The superego builds up and protects the unity of the ego, secures its development under the reality principle, and thus works in the service of Eros. However, the superego attains these objectives by directing the ego against its id, turning part of the destruction instincts against a part of the personality, by destroying, splitting the unity of the personality as a whole. Thus it works in the service of the antagonist of the life instinct. This inner-directed destructiveness, moreover, constitutes the moral core of the mature personality. Conscience, the most cherished moral agency of the civilized individual, emerges as permeated with the death instinct. The categorical imperative that the superego enforces remains an imperative of self-destruction, while it constructs the social existence of personality. The work of repression pertains to the death instinct as well as the life instinct. Normally, their fusion is a healthy one, but the sustained severity of the superego constantly threatens this healthy balance. The more a man checks his aggressive tendencies toward others, the more tyrannical, that is, aggressive, he becomes in his ego ideal. The more intense become the aggressive tendencies of his ego ideal against his ego. Driven to the extreme in melancholia, a pure culture of the death instinct may hold sway in the superego. It may become a kind of gathering place for the death instincts. But this extreme danger has its roots in the normal situation of the ego, since the ego's work results in a liberation of the aggressive instincts in the superego. Its struggle against the libido exposes it to the danger of maltreatment and death. In suffering under the attacks of the superego, or perhaps even succumbing to them, The ego is meeting with a fate like that of the protozoa, which are destroyed by the products of disintegration that they themselves have created. And Freud adds that, from the mental economic point of view, the morality that functions in the superego seems to be a similar product of disintegration. It is in this context that Freud's metapsychology comes face to face with the fatal dialectic of civilization. The very progress of civilization leads to the release of increasingly destructive forces. In order to elucidate the connection between Freud's individual psychology and the theory of civilization, it will be necessary to resume the interpretation of the instinctual dynamic at a different level, namely the phylogenetic one.